Greetings, boys, girls, fucks, cucks, and everything in between. It is I, obviously Jesus, here with the last video for January 2018. Already 1 month through what is guaranteed to be a shit year. It is Tuesday, my dudes, and the State of the Union is tonight. Maybe I'll make the next video about that. But in lieu of topics, I have had to pick one. I probably shouldn't have gone through like 17 topics in that lightning round video, and I should have, stretched it out and milked it more. Just milked it. I hope I'm in focus. One of the problems with making videos on your own is that you can't really get a good focus without the remote control that I haven't bought yet, but that's where the Patreon money is going to go, or $20 of it at least, maybe even 10, because I think there's an Amazon Basics one going on there. But next month I'm hopefully in focus. Right now I think I am, but the back screen of the camera is not exactly the best place to see like pixel level detail. So I hope I'm in focus, and we'll fix that for February's videos as well. But anyway, today's video is called How I Learned to Start Worrying and Hate the Bomb, because we're going to talk about the dangers of removing the human factor from warfare, both modern and historical. So let's get into that, because as I was going to say when I was doing my little hand motion, I picked my own topic this week in lieu of other ones. But anyway, there is, I would contend, a real danger to removing the human factor from war in any way, shape, or form, because war as a concept needs to have a real physical human cost in order to stem this tide that we see these days and this trend that we have towards automating warfare, making it more efficient, making it more deadly, all while removing the human cost, which is the main deterrent to warfare. Because when you have to, in order to go to war, shed the blood of your sons and daughters and your nation's sons and daughters, that is, as far as I'm concerned, the only sufficient deterrent to perpetual warfare. And even that hasn't stopped people from being really what is called hawkish. I don't know if that's a term that exists outside of the United States, but hawkishness means basically, it's from the word warhawk, which just means someone who is constantly chomping at the bit towards military intervention. And so even costing the lives of the nation's sons and daughters hasn't stopped us here in the United States. And this is obviously going to be coming from a pretty American perspective in this video. So even losing our citizens' lives hasn't stopped politicians from declaring war. So the idea that we would, the idea that we're going to move away from having that cost and that one remaining deterrent to war is pretty alarming to me, because you can see it already in a lot of different ways, and we'll talk about the main one here in just a second. But it really is alarming to me that we're trying to take away the human aspect of war, the terrifying moment where you're trying to, if you're killing another person, I truly believe that you have to be willing to either yourself or send somebody to another part of the world to look them in the eye, and if they're going to attempt to take their life, because otherwise it becomes too easy, it becomes too far removed, it becomes just a thing on a screen, a statistic you read in a report later. And that is the trend we're on right now, especially as a world power here in America, and that is a very disturbing thing to me as far as I'm concerned. And of course, the main number one example of this that we see today is through the use of drones. Drone use, I believe, started under George W. Bush, where we started developing that sort of drone remote control weapon delivery technology. But it was actually President Obama, the cool president, the Spotify playlist Kendrick Lamar listening, coffee comedian, car getting fucking president, who really expanded the use of drones, not only in our current declared war zones, but in other countries like Pakistan, and I believe Libya, and there's probably one or two other ones that I can't remember off the top of my head. So it was Obama, it was the most recent administration who really expanded the use of drones to what I believe is an alarming level. And drones on some level feel like a violation of the rights of the people that we are, as the United States, occupying or otherwise engaging in military operations against. Like, we don't have any stated operations in Pakistan. We don't have a declaration of war on Pakistan or anybody in Pakistan. So it's weird that you're going in Pakistan and doing all these things because, the United States, is probably the biggest example and just the baddest example of how, or the worst example, I should say. Baddest is not a word, but it's the worst example of the use of automated warfare because they constitute such a massive, massive advantage for countries like us that can use them over countries that cannot occupy foreign territory in the same way that we can. I mean, it's not like we have our drones over Iraq or Afghanistan, and Afghanistan and Iraq have them over us, and it's kind of like we're on an equal playing field. We have complete and total not only surveillance but missile delivery powers over them without risking a single human life, and that is on some level, I think, fucked up because at that point there is no reason if we're trying to. There is no reason to pull out at that point because you can maintain control over an entire area, a massive area without even risking a single human life just through the use of drones alone. You can kill, you can surveil, you can do whatever you want without human life. You can do it on some, I assume they run on like gasoline or diesel or something. So, God forbid they run on fucking solar. But we have just such a massive advantage over them that it creates in us no willingness to stop our occupation. And that is the problem because it sets the stage for perpetual occupation at no human cost and does not respect the rights and the space and the sovereignty of the countries that we are occupying. And just like I said, sets the stage for us to be there as long as we want. Not as long as is necessary, as long as we want, which is not always the same thing and rarely ever is. And all this that I'm going to say about drones is pretty much irrespective of all the, collateral damage and civilian casualties that were a result of the Obama administration's increased use of drones. There are a couple articles, I'll try to remember to link to them, in I think it's the Washington Post or something, that details just the complete and total the secrecy and the shame and the complete abuse of these drones and how much collateral damage, how many civilians they've killed, how many times they've targeted weddings instead of the actual terrorist gatherings they were trying to shoot. So even irrespective of all the horrible practicalities of drones and how disgusting it is that the cool president is the guy who is also bombing weddings by mistake with drones and oversaw the expansion of that program. Not that he did it maliciously, I think, but I think that he was reluctant to walk that back and did surround the drone statistics and the civilian casualty statistics with a lot of secrecy. But it's disgusting to me that he's the cool president. And I don't talk a lot about. I've talked a few times about Trump on here, but it's more objectionable to me because Trump is obviously bad. He is easy to hate, whereas a lot of people I know and I follow on social media and everything are instead taken in by Obama and his persona and these heavily scripted comedy bits that he does and these appearances on talk shows and, like I said, Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee, which I just actually watched the other day, or that Letterman show on Netflix he's on now. It worries me because, Trump is obviously bad, but yet people get taken in by the opposite end of the spectrum. You hate the neocons, but you get taken in by the neoliberals and people who think Hillary Clinton was great when she stood for nothing but the continuation of Obama's problematic legacy. And while we're on the subject, if your policies, I do not deny that the Democrats have a good domestic policy most of the time. And they have their heads in the right place, and that's what makes them better than the Republicans. But if your policies are good for the United States, but bad for people in the Middle East, how are you any better than one of those motherfuckers who's out there in the red hat chanting America first? Because that's basically what the Obama and Hillary neoliberal platform is. America first, America gets good shit, we get more democratized or socialized healthcare, healthcare for everybody, oversee the legalization of gay marriage in all 50 states, good stuff like that. Meanwhile, the brown people in the Middle East are suffering. So how are the neoliberals like Obama and Clinton better than the America First crowd? They're not. They're just delivering on the American First promise, whereas the Republicans do not. They just can't get anything right. But yeah, so that's just a little bit of a side there. But even regardless of the civilian casualties of drones, the simple use of drones means that we don't ever have to pull out, and that's terrifying. I mean, there's things today that are constituted, or that constitute war crimes. We have things like the Geneva Conventions and the Geneva Protocol that ban certain types of warfare. I believe that there's like 4-point bayonets that would cause an unstitchable wound. Those are illegal under the Geneva Convention. Chemical germ warfare is illegal under the Geneva Protocol. There are plenty of rules regarding, not taking hostages of civilians, mistreating political prisoners or prisoners of war. There's a lot of things that we have that are banned under those Geneva Conventions because they are considered too inhumane even for warfare. And I think that there needs to be some kind of limit on just automating warfare while you're occupying territory, because I think at some point it should be considered, after some duration or after some level of automation, it should be considered a war crime to occupy a place without even risking your own country's soldiers, because it creates, like I said 3 times now, it creates no deterrent to perpetual occupation. Because being an occupying force while also having little risk of losing an actual person sets the stage for just perpetual occupation. And we see that trend in the Middle East right now. We're never going to stop in the Middle East. We've been doing it since the 60s, and the more automated warfare gets, the less likely we are to stop. Obviously machines and automation will never be completely gone from warfare. I mean, there's like automated missile defense systems and everything, but I think that it needs to be limited to, especially when it comes to offensive capability, not defensive. I think there needs to be a limit set by some international body like the UN or what have you, to how much automation you can have in an offensive scenario or as an occupying force. Otherwise, it just snowballs into pretty much a disaster. And again, you sort of override the sovereignty and the rights of the people to not live under constant threat of, surveillance or, being accidentally bombed by the Obama administration or now the Trump administration, who I'm sure Trump is fucking loving drones. I'm sure he watches the drone strikes like a fucking kid watching an action movie or something. But anyway, there's a cycle here. The more we automate war, the less unpopular it becomes, because people are generally concerned with, oh, I don't want my son or daughter going over there and dying. So the more we automate warfare, the less unpopular it becomes, and the more profitable it becomes for technology companies who are developing these advancements in drones and weapons, etc. And those companies get rich. They get big government contracts and they can get rich. And they can influence lawmakers through the purchase of lobbyists. And they can influence the lawmakers and get lawmakers elected and give them campaign funds. They can elect the lawmakers who will perpetuate more war. They will elect the most hawkish lawmakers, presidents, congresspeople that they can, in order to perpetuate war, perpetuate their government contracts, et cetera, and we just have this big fucking cycle. And this is kind of the sly trick that, again, President Obama used when he expanded his drone program. Despite the civilian casualties that he might have caused over there, he can always play it off. Any president now can play it off as using drones to save American lives, no matter how many other lives it costs in civilian casualties over there. And because the problem is, we as Americans perceive American lives as being more valuable than those of people in these Middle Eastern countries who are getting collateral damage off the face of the fucking earth. It is kind of, disgustingly nationalistic, and it goes very much hand in hand with, your typical boilerplate xenophobia and racism. I mean, I don't know that we're ever going to see like a full-on Metal Gear Solid 4 type situation where corporations are just fighting endless proxy wars, but I do think that unchecked, we will see the world's military powers drag out both new and existing conflicts, oppressing and occupying regions for years on end, because they're not risking their soldiers as technology advances. There's just going to be less and less risk, less and less deterrent, and we will see more perpetual soft wars, which I don't know if that term has been used in relation to this before, but what I would say constitutes a soft war is a war fought not by humans, but by drones and other kinds of mechanized vehicles, potentially even like robots at some point in the future, but that's a bit off. Of course, occupiers will do whatever they can to prevent other powers from using this technology as well, like how we currently try to stop other countries that we don't like from developing nuclear weapons. We don't want them to be able to, you know, God forbid they can exert the same amount of force that we can. We will absolutely use this in that way as a tool of suppression as well. And while we're on the subject of private corporations getting involved in this, PMCs I think also need to be abolished by the UN or by their individual countries, or severely limited perhaps to domestic security operations, because it needs to be hard to fight and start a war. It needs to be limited to elected officials who are accountable to the people, not rich dudes with lots of guns and some questionable political ideologies, I'm sure. Now I want to take a quick look, though, at the origins of this kind of tendency, of this kind of idea. And for me personally, I do see a big philosophical link to, for this current mentality, back to the use of the A-bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We did drop flyers. I will say, this is something that I didn't know until like 5 years ago or something, but when we were about to bomb Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we wanted to do it as a show of force. Not necessarily to, you know, kill as many people as possible and cripple Japan and terrify them. We wanted to just level the city to sort of prove to them that we were immensely powerful, which is, you know, problematic in and of itself. But, you know, we weren't doing it just to kill civilians, of course. We dropped flyers from planes saying to evacuate because, you know, we didn't want to kill a ton of civilians. But the truth of the matter is that it's kind of not a choice that you can typically give people in war, and it's kind of a cowardly choice, because get out or die in a nuclear fireball is not really a tenable war strategy. When you go into Iraq or Afghanistan, you don't just, you know, invade a city that's occupied by the enemy and say, okay, everybody living in this city is an enemy combatant, automatically everybody we see dies. No, everybody who stays dies. No, that's not how you do it. That's a war crime. You don't do that. You don't just go through killing civilians. You don't do that. It's not how you fight a war. You go door to door and you make a determination as to whether or not the people in behind each door are a danger to you or not. And, you know, that's how warfare should be conducted. It should be conducted on a person-to-person level with a human being making decisions. Obviously, they're not always going to make the right decision, but it's better than just blanket killing every single civilian in an area. And, you know, we had many soldiers in the Pacific theater of war towards the end of World War II who could have fought to take Japan, or we could have blockaded the country and tried more diplomacy as the food supplies dwindled and Japanese leaders realized that they had to give up or their people would start dying, and then at least you could share the blame, I suppose. Many soldiers would have died on both sides in a full-scale invasion of Japan, but how is that better than taking the lives of, I believe the total is somewhere around 250,000 Japanese non-combatants? That, to me, doesn't make sense. Because, I mean, I guess the one counter argument might be that I actually looked up statistics on this, and about 60% of US soldiers in World War II were drafted, and about 40% were volunteers. So the counter argument, I guess, there is that these guys didn't necessarily sign up to fight and die, which is not the case today in the modern world. But, there's still 40% volunteers, and how is it better to kill civilians than to risk losing people who are trained for combat, volunteer or not? Saying that is not an argument specifically for the bombing. It's just an argument that there's really no good choice and that you have to sort of make a more utilitarian determination. But I do think that the nuclear bombings of Japan were one of the most cowardly acts in American history, one of the most indiscriminate acts of violence in all of American or human history. And I think they set the tone, personally, for this trend towards faceless warfare, that I would call it, that we see now with drones and taking away and leaving it to, faceless things dropping bombs rather than, you know, actual people going door to door with guns, which I think, while probably harrowing while you're in there, it's importantly harrowing, I think, because if you're not harrowed, is that a word, while you're fighting a war where people might die, yourself or the enemy, then there is a danger of it becoming too sterile and too removed from the actual violence that is being perpetrated on the people who, in the case of the United States, we are now occupying and interfering with and have been interfering with for 5, almost 6 decades. To go back to the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki for just a moment, treating those bombings as anything but cowardly acts involves dehumanizing Japanese civilians to a ridiculous point, which is just what we do today with the civilian casualties in the Middle East. We treat them as less valuable inherently than American lives, but any person from a third country or any anthropologist will tell you that no one life is intrinsically more valuable than another. You have this idea that, you know, your life is more valuable than the citizen of another country, especially one that supposedly harbors terrorists or has that connotation. But, you know, it's no more valid than, you know, picking a sports team you like because of where your mother spat you out of her fucking vagina. It has no objective correspondence to reality. A life is a life is a life. They are not worth intrinsically more than the other. And to say that they are allows these types of cowardly acts and these war crimes to occur, where we don't care about civilian deaths and we just go and do what is necessary blindly because we're saving American lives and one of us is worth 10 of them or what have you. And not only that, the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki set forth an arms race that even now in the post-Cold War world, it may ultimately, as I talked about in a previous video, prove to be the end of civilization. And so I think that looking back on Hiroshima and Nagasaki as anything but cowardly acts that doomed mankind is, I don't know how you can see them as anything but that. In closing though, any advancement in remote killing, that is, killing that doesn't involve a person-to-person combat, is a detriment to humanity as a whole. It dupes the citizens of the country that uses these faceless killing apparatuses, I guess, if that's even a word, and it abuses the people who are on the receiving end of these weapons. You want to invade, you want to kill, you want to occupy, you better fucking be willing to risk your life, risk your citizens' lives and your soldiers' lives, risk losing, as a politician, your approval ratings. It's a fucking high cost, and it absolutely should be. There is no excuse, especially, and this is a key distinction, especially now, there is no excuse when the United States military is all volunteer. Let the people who signed up to support the United States' racist wars and their policies and their terrible civilian casualties and disregarding those, let these idiots who support these terrible, terrible policies fight and die rather than innocent Pakistani families at a wedding that was mistakenly targeted by a drone. But anyway, I'm obviously Jesus. That's a happy note to end January on. I will see you next week in February.